Hallo meine Damen und Herren und herzlich willkommen. Das ist die 18. Lektion in unserer Reise durch die deutsche Sprache. Actually, I should be greeting you with Grüezi miteinander. Why? Because that's the authentic Swiss way to say hello. Also dann, nochmals. Grüezi miteinander. In this lesson, we're going to accompany Ralph and Mia Gruber on an adventure through Switzerland as they visit the large urban city of Zurich and the small alpine village of Zermatt. As always, their conversations are going to help us learn more useful vocabulary and grammar, as well as give us a glimpse into the exciting cultures in the German-speaking world. Alles klar? Gut. Das schweizerische Abenteuer beginnt in der Stadt Zürich. Note that Switzerland is made up of cantone or cantons. A canton is basically a state within a federal nation. Now, in Germany and Austria, states are called Bundesländer, but in Switzerland they're called Kantone. Und es gibt 26 Schweizer Kantone. Die Stadt Zürich liegt im Kanton Zürich und hat über 400.000 Einwohner. Die Grubers übernachten im Hotel St. Joseph. It's a quaint hotel with an incredible view of the downtown area. Let's listen in now as they discuss their plans for their stay in Zürich. Also dann, Herr und Frau Gruber, bitteschön.
Das Hotel ist sehr schön. Das hast du gut gemacht, Ralf.
Natürlich, ich biete meiner Prinzessin nur das Beste.
Danke, mein Prinz. Und jetzt zum Plan.
Gut, was möchtest du machen?
Ich möchte eine Schweizer Schokoladenfabrik besuchen.
Toll. Also dann, los geht's.
Now that sounds like a great plan. Die Grubers wollen eine schweizerische Schokoladenfabrik besuchen. Lecker. Ich liebe Schokolade. Ich esse gern Zartbitterschokolade. How about you? Are you a Zartbitter or more of a Milchschokolade person? Nein, Entschuldigung. I suppose that's kind of a personal question. Also dann, let's take a moment to consider some of the grammar that we heard in Ralph and Mia's dialogue. For instance, after Mia compliments Ralph on finding such a nice hotel, Ralph jokingly says to her, Natürlich, ich biete meiner Prinzessin nur das Beste. Note that Ralph's cutesy response here is actually a grammatically complex sentence. It contains a nominative subject, ich, an accusative direct object, das Beste, and a dative indirect object, meine Prinzessin. Let's talk more about that one word in particular, meine. Recall that mein is a possessive pronoun. Possessive pronouns precede nouns, and they belong to a larger group of words called ein words, which you'll remember take various endings depending on the number, gender, and case of the noun they precede. For example, in Ralph's tongue-in-cheek utterance, ich biete meiner Prinzessin nur das Beste, the noun that the possessive pronoun mein is modifying, Prinzessin, is a singular feminine noun in the dative case. And as we can see, ein words like mein take an ER for singular feminine dative nouns. Ich biete meiner Prinzessin nur das Beste. But of course, mein isn't the only possessive pronoun in German. As we've learned, there are several. There are possessive pronouns for first, second, and third person perspectives, for singular and plural numbers, and for masculine, feminine, and neuter genders. Here again is our famous table for possessive pronouns, just to jog your memory. You remember all of these, right? Ausgezeichnet. So let's choose just one of these ein-word possessive pronouns to serve as our model for our endings. Let's go with unser. Also dann, when unser precedes a singular masculine noun like der Hund, in the nominative case, there's no ending. It's just unser Hund. In the accusative case, though, it's unseren Hund, and in the dative, it's unserem Hund. Before a singular feminine noun like die Katze, in both the nominative and accusative, unser takes an E, unsere Katze. And in the dative, it takes an ER, unserer Katze. With a singular neuter noun like das Kind, unser takes no ending for the nominative and accusative cases, unser Kind, but in the dative it takes an em, unserem Kind. Moving on to the endings for ein words before plural nouns, like die Kinder, unser takes an e in both the nominative and accusative, unsere Kinder, and in the dative, it takes an en plus an extra n on the following noun, unseren Kindern. Und das ist alles. These are all the ein-word endings for nouns in all three cases, 3 genders, and 2 numbers. As always, I encourage you to follow up on this grammar with the exercises in the course workbook. Nun, meine Damen und Herren, let's step away from grammar for a moment and let's return to Zürich. Because remember, we still have a Swiss chocolate factory to visit. Ich hoffe, Sie haben das nicht vergessen. Also dann, los geht's in die schweizerische Schokoladenfabrik.
Hier ist die Eingangshalle. Sehr schön.
Die Sitzbank sieht wie ein Schokoriegel aus.
Und das ist der Gründer von der Schokoladenfabrik.
Ich möchte diesem Mann einen großen Kuss geben, denn Schokolade macht mich glücklich.
Wirklich? Und welchen anderen Angestellten möchtest du einen Kuss geben?
Das muss ein Traumjob sein. Schau mal, der Schokoshop.
Willst du ein paar Süßigkeiten kaufen?
Natürlich, ich kaufe unseren Kindern ein Dutzend Schokoriegel.
Und was kaufst du deinem Prinzen?
Wem?
Na mir. Welche Süßigkeiten kaufst du deinem Prinzen?
Ach so. Ja, ich kaufe meinem Prinzen auch einen Schokoriegel.
Danke.
Is it just me, or did that visit to the Schokoladenfabrik make you hungry for chocolate too? Warte mal, ich glaube, ich habe etwas in der Tasche. Ach so, ein Schokoriegel. Und er ist zartbitter. Das ist gut. Und gesund. You know what? I'll save some for later though, because right now, we need to talk about yet another important piece to German's dative case grammar. Das schmeckt gut. And wouldn't you know it, we can find what we're looking for in Ralph and Mia's dialogue. Sind Sie überrascht? Also dann, let's go to the beginning of their conversation when they've just entered the chocolate factory's Eingangshalle. On the wall of the Eingangshalle, Ralph points out that there's a portrait of the factory's Gründer. Mia then comments, ich möchte diesem Mann einen großen Kuss geben, denn Schokolade macht mich glücklich. Her utterance has a nominative subject, ich, and both an accusative direct object, einen großen Kuss, and a dative indirect object, diesem Mann. But this time, the indirect object is preceded by a der word, dies. And accordingly, this der word has a dative ending, em, diesem Mann. Now, recall that just like ein words, der words take their own set of endings, which also depend on the number, gender, and case of the noun they precede. Remember, too, that der words include the definite articles, as well as the words dies, jed, welch, and solch. In fact, there's another place in Ralph and Mia's dialogue where a der word occurs with a dative ending. After Mia admits about the founder of the chocolate factory, ich möchte diesem Mann einen großen Kuss geben, Ralph recognizes yet another opportunity to tease his wife in his typical loving fashion, and so he asks her, und welchen anderen Angestellten möchtest du einen Kuss geben? The nominative subject in Ralph's cheeky utterance is du, which is giving an accusative direct object, einen großen Kuss, to a dative indirect object, den Angestellten. But as we can see, Ralph uses a different der word in his utterance. He uses welch, which modifies the noun Angestellten. And just like the der word, dies, from Mia's utterance, the der word welch needs an ending that expresses the grammatical case, number, and gender of the noun it's modifying. Here, Angestellten is a plural noun in the dative case. So its ending is ien. Welchen Angestellten? Speaking of der words like dies and welch, let's cast our eyes on yet another fabulous table of German word endings, namely the endings that der words take. Also dann, we'll use the der word dies as our dress-up mannequin, so to speak. Starting with the endings for singular masculine nouns like der Hund. In the nominative, the ending is er, dieser Hund. For the accusative, it's en, diesen Hund. And for the dative, it's an em, diesem Hund. For singular feminine nouns like die Katze, der words take an e in the nominative and accusative, diese Katze, and an er in the dative, dieser Katze. For singular neuter nouns like das Kind, the ending is es for the nominative and accusative, dieses Kind, and em for the dative, diesem Kind. As for plural nouns like die Kinder, der words take an e in the nominative and accusative cases, diese Kinder, and in the dative case, der words take an en plus an extra n on the following noun, diesen Kindern. Und das ist alles. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, meine Güte, es gibt so viele Endungen. How will I ever learn all these darn endings? Well, I can tell you from experience that it takes time, effort, and practice to get all these endings down, let alone to be able to use them in conversation. So please give yourself some time. Above all, be sure to work through the supplementary grammar explanations and exercises in the workbook. And don't worry if you don't get every ending correct on the first go-round. Remember our favorite saying? Übung macht den Meister. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, take a deep breath. Tief durchatmen. Because it's now time for the second leg of our travels through Switzerland with Ralph and Mia. Alles klar? Gut, denn jetzt reisen wir nach Zermatt. Zermatt liegt in dem Kanton Wallis und hat rund 6000 Einwohner. Das ist die Stadt. Sie ist sehr schön, besonders im Winter. Not far from the city of Zermatt lies one of the tallest mountain peaks in the world, das Matterhorn. Now, Ralph has always been fascinated by das Matterhorn, and especially by the history of mountaineering surrounding the mountain. And so he convinces Mia to go visit a special Matterhorn museum in Zermatt called das Zermattlantis. Let's listen in now as Ralph and Mia check out this fascinating alpine museum.
Schau mal, das Museum heißt Zermattlantis.
Interessant. Gehen wir hinein. Das ist beeindruckend. Schau mal, das ist eine Alphütte für die Pferde.
Wirklich? Die Bergpioniere haben den Pferden ihre eigenen Hütten gebaut?
Bitte?
Du hast eben gesagt, dass sie ihnen Alphütten gebaut haben.
Nein.
Also, sie haben sie ihnen nicht gebaut.
Nein, sie haben ihnen Ställe gebaut.
Also keine Pferdehütten?
Nein, Pferdeställe.
Nun, haben Sie alles verstanden? Yes, I realize that this dialogue was a bit more challenging, aber keine Panik. We'll go over a few key passages now. And remember that all dialogues are also available in print in the course workbook. So then, let's home in on a few grammatical constructions from Ralph and Mia's conversation in the Matterhorn Museum. Recall that at one point, Ralph describes what he thinks is eine Alphütte für die Pferde. Mia then decides to tease him a little about this silly-sounding comment, and so she asks him, die Bergpioniere haben den Pferden ihre eigenen Hütten gebaut? Now, aside from its charming wittiness, Mia's question can also teach us another important lesson about German word order. Here's her question again. Note that, in accordance with what we've seen in our last two lessons, the dative indirect object, den Pferden, comes before the accusative direct object, ihre eigenen Hütten. And in fact, this is almost always the case in both main and dependent clauses. For example, Ralph might say, ich weiß, dass die Bergpioniere den Pferden ihre eigenen Hütten gebaut haben. However, we also know that we can use pronouns in place of nouns, assuming, of course, that the context is appropriate. Remember that you can't just walk up to someone and say, I don't know if we should buy them an iPhone. The other person will look at you and ask, who? In other words, the noun phrase you're replacing with a pronoun has to have been mentioned already, or it has to be clear to the other speaker before you use the pronoun. Ralph and Mia both use pronouns, as well as noun phrases, in their quirky exchange about alpine cabins and horses. Ralph, for example, responds to Mia's cheeky question with, Nein, sie haben ihnen Ställe gebaut. Notice that even as a pronoun, the indirect object still comes before the direct object. The subject pronoun here, sie, is referring to the plural nominative noun, die Bergpioniere, which Ralph and Mia have mentioned a few times in their dialogue. And the indirect object pronoun, ihnen, is referring to the plural dative noun, die Pferde, whose reference Ralph and Mia are also aware of, and which allows them to use this in pronoun form. The accusative direct object, Stelle, however, remains in the noun phrase. Here, then, is the general rule for German sentences when it comes to word order with things like nouns and pronouns. Are you ready? Here it is. The indirect object always comes before the direct object unless the direct object is in pronoun form. To see what I'm talking about, let's take a look at something else that Mia says to Ralph. In her attempt to continue lovingly teasing Ralph for claiming that the early mountain pioneers built separate cabins just for their horses, Mia says, Ach so, Sie haben sie ihnen nicht gebaut? What Mia does here is replace all of the nouns with pronouns, and she can do this because she and Ralph have established enough context for them both to understand which nouns these pronouns are referring to. So, for example, Mia uses the subject plural pronoun sie to refer to the nominative plural noun die Bergpioniere. She uses the direct object plural pronoun sie to refer to the accusative plural noun Alphütten. And then she uses the indirect object plural pronoun ihnen to refer to the dative plural noun die Pferde. Phew. Okay. I realize how that might sound. Complicated, right? But the main takeaway here is to understand this. Each pronoun that Mia uses refers to a specific noun with a corresponding number, gender, and case that she and Ralph have already established in their conversation. Now, notice that in Mia's utterance, both the direct and indirect object are pronouns. So, do you remember what our word order rule is? Genau. The indirect object always comes before the direct object unless the direct object is in pronoun form. And in fact, this is exactly the case in Mia's utterance. Also, Sie haben sie ihnen nicht gebaut. The direct object sie is a pronoun. Therefore, it needs to come before the indirect pronoun ihnen. Alles klar? Again, I realize that this can seem a little confusing the first time you hear it. It was for me, I remember clearly. But I promise you, it's not really that complicated. All you need to do is just remember this rule. The indirect object always comes before the direct object unless the direct object is in pronoun form. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, before we say Auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich, let's do a short exercise to help us get the hang of this word order rule. This is going to be another one of those unscramble the pieces of the sentence exercises. And remember, whichever part is underlined, that's the part that we want to begin the sentence with. Alles klar? Also dann. Here's our first scrambled sentence. So, we start with die Studenten. In this sentence, die Studenten is also the subject. Now, let's arrange the remaining words into their grammatically correct order. After the subject, die Studenten, we put in the main verb, schenkt. Next, we need to identify the direct object. Here, it's the singular masculine accusative noun, einen Mercedes. Because it's the thing that the subject is supposed to gift. Then, we put in the indirect object, the singular masculine dative dem Professor. Because it's the person to whom the subject is giving something. And finally, we put in the element of manner, zum Geburtstag. And voila! We have our complete sentence. Die Studentin schenkt dem Professor einen Mercedes zum Geburtstag. Note in particular that since the accusative direct object Mercedes is a noun and not a pronoun, it therefore comes after the indirect object dem Professor. Okay, let's do one more. This scrambled sentence is actually a reply to that last sentence. Keep in mind that we can use pronouns in this sentence because we are now aware of the people or things that the pronouns indicate. So then, we'll start with the time element, morgen, which we follow with the conjugated verb schenkt. Next, we put in the subject, sie, and then we go on our hunt for the direct and indirect objects. As we can see, both objects are expressed as pronouns. Ihn is a singular, third-person masculine pronoun in the accusative case, and ihm is also a singular, third-person masculine pronoun, but it is in the dative case. This means that ihn is the direct object referring to the thing that's going to be given, that is, den Mercedes, while ihm is the indirect object and is referring to dem Professor, the person to whom the Mercedes is going to be given. So weit, so gut? Now, most importantly, because the direct object is expressed as a pronoun, this means that it needs to come before the indirect object, even though the indirect object is also a pronoun. Remember our word order rule. And there we have it. Our complete sentence reads, morgen schenkt sie ihn ihm. Now, as I've already mentioned, this can seem a bit complicated at first blush. But just remember to go through each step, like we did together here, and to practice, practice, practice. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, I hope you enjoyed today's adventures in Zürich and Zermatt. The next lesson will mark another exciting milestone in your journey through the German language. Just ahead, meine Damen und Herren, is the start of the fourth and second to last stage of your journey. Machen Sie sich bereit! Auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich!